Now, having just given you all these abiotic characters, one of the things we should investigate is how populations actually respond to this. I said to you earlier that the abiotic factors determine basically where organisms can live. And so the question then is, how do we actually figure this out? It turns out that organisms have certain adaptations to deal with the environment and its ecology. And if you are going to be in a very cold environment, then obviously those kind of things that make you well adapted to the cold are going to be very visible. If you are living in a very warm environment, then those kinds of adaptations that make you able to live in a warm environment will become more visible. And ultimately, since there is a continuing interaction between the environment and the organism, you will expect certain phenotypes in one type of environmental area than in another. So if you're looking for, let's say, cool areas in the ocean, well, cool areas in the ocean, if you're a mammal, they require a certain amount of adaptation, such as perhaps a thick layer of blubber to keep you warm. It requires perhaps that you migrate. That's an adaptation. It requires that you change how and where you breed. And so those are the kind of things that you might see in response, in an evolutionary response by organisms. Any of these kinds of adaptations that we see are specialized to deal with the environment that an organism finds itself in. So organisms that are very well able to deal with an environment are, based on our idea of natural selection, those that will then be able to survive better and have more offspring. Whereas if you are ill-equipped to deal with your environment, then you clearly don't have that advantage, and so natural selection may work against you. Now, because the abiotic factors change a lot, there is also one added thing about adaptations. It's great to have an adaptation for cold. It's great to have an adaptation to warmth. But if you have those adaptations and you're highly specialized for cold or warm, then that means you better live in a place that's cold or you live in a place that's warm. And so that's great. You are going to be very successful in those areas. But if the temperatures change a lot, then it would even be better if, as part of your adaptation, you had a way to deal with change. So it's great to be able to have all the things you need to live in the cold or in the heat, but it's even better if you can somehow change, if you have adaptations for that change. And so dealing with something that's unpredictable is a very important aspect of how organisms live. And some of the most successful organisms, the ones that you'll find all over the world, are those that have the ability to change. Organisms that are not able to change and they live on cool mountaintops surrounded by tropical forests, you'll find that if those cool mountaintops disappear, so will the organism, right? Because they don't have that flexibility. So this interplay between the environment and how the organism can adapt is very important. So, how does an organism actually deal with the environment? Well, whichever environment you find yourself in, there are limits to what you can do. Now, an individual is one thing, but the individual is not what evolves. So what we really have to figure out is how this manifests itself at the population level. Some birds, like this one, overwinter. And they overwinter because they have a nice set of feathers and they can thermoregulate well, so they have the ability to find food even though it's snowy outside. And so those organisms can stay put because they can tolerate these broad changes in temperature over the seasons. Other birds can't do this, and so they migrate. Both of those are valid strategies. Those are both driven by certain adaptations, and as a consequence, in one case, like these ones, they adjust, and in others they don't. Now, when you look for adaptations that have to do with adjusting to the environment, you look for them in three areas. One of those is going to be physiology. That means the inner workings of the body. Another one is anatomy, which means the structures required to survive in different conditions. And the last one, and this is kind of the cop-out one, is behavior. If you can't handle it, then move. So any of those are important to investigate when you're trying to assess whether an organism is well equipped to deal with its environment. So let's take as an example physiological responses. If you are an organism that needs to deal with rapid temperature change, for example, then clearly your physiology needs to be able to adapt to fairly rapid changes. So if you live in an environment where the temperature changes quickly, then your physiology should also reflect that. And we call this ability to change your physiology in different environmental conditions physiological plasticity. Plasticity is a term that shows or that expresses how variable the conditions of how an organism interacts with its environment can be. So physiological plasticity is an important aspect of an organism's adaptation. It's an adaptation in and of itself. If you are an organism who is physiologically plastic, meaning you can handle all kinds of different conditions, that can be a great advantage, even though it may appear that you're just general in how you work. And as a consequence of this physiological plasticity, you can acclimate to different conditions. And you acclimate gradually as your physiology adjusts, and that physiology can also revert to where it was before. Now, this is clearly something very important if you're an organism that has to adapt to seasons and stays put. So the physiological response of that bird needs to be able to acclimate to the cooler temperatures and then back to the warmer temperatures during the summer. Now, there is therefore a great advantage to have an internal heat source. Endotherms, organisms like birds and mammals, we can tolerate these real important and really wide temperature extremes because we have the ability, this plasticity on the inside, and the environment can change as much as it wants. Our body temperature doesn't have to change. Reptiles are very different because when it snows outside, they're not moving. So if you're a frog or a lizard, you better find a place to survive where you don't freeze, and that's where you have to stay. So this aspect of physiological plasticity is very important when it comes to figuring out where organisms can live. Now here's an example for this with the number of lizard species in the United States. And if you look at the color patterns, which I realize is not so good on your screen, but over here on the left, you'll find that 0 lizards are the areas that are the coldest. So above this line and this line, that's where you find no lizards. There are no lizards for those areas. Now this is Massachusetts, this is New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. So there aren't any lizards over there. It's just too cold. If you look at the line that divides 1 through 5 species and 6 to 10 species, which is this line here that basically follows this pattern, that line, it turns out, is approximately the 4 degrees Celsius line. So if you look at the average temperature over the year, the average temperature over the winter in North America, you'll find that if you live below this line, the average temperature doesn't drop below 4 degrees Celsius. Yes, there are certainly cold snaps, and clearly we are here and we do have cool nights. There's freezing, right? Temperatures going into the teens sometimes. But most of the time it averages out because the day is so warm. That's why this is the average temperature here. So if the average temperature in the winter dips below 4 degrees, then you're going to have fewer than 6 lizard species that can handle it in North America. So you find a clear delineation between the organisms that can handle cooler temperatures and the ones that cannot. And so as a consequence, you would say that lizards are not as physiologically plastic as other organisms. If you look at most birds, you'll find that this line does not exist. There are other factors that keep birds from going north. But in most cases, you'll find that there is no line like this when it comes to birds or mammals, because they have that internal heat. Now, there are a variety of anatomical and behavioral responses, and these are really too varied to list them all because there's all kinds of neat things out there. But this may be a change in body shape or particular anatomical features, things like salt excreting glands, blubber, certainly, certain types of thermoregulatory structure like feathers. And a lot of these even change with the season. So if you look at mammalian fur, when it comes to winter versus summer, you'll find a difference in the quality of that fur. You'll find that the fur is much thicker during the winter, and so once it gets warmer again, a lot of the fur gets shed again. So there are a variety of these anatomical things. Behavioral adaptations clearly are primarily limited to animals. Plants can move with the sun, we know this, but they don't have an immediate ability to react. They don't react very quickly, whereas animals can. So behavioral adaptations, which would certainly include localized movement. In some cases, if it's just too sunny out, you move to the shade, and that will cool you down. You move into a burrow, that'll cool you down even more. So that would be local movement. Or you may have seasonal migration, such as the whale example I mentioned. Or perhaps specialized mating. You adapt by changing your food sources between different seasons. So there are all kinds of things that organisms can do behaviorally that allow them to persist in an environment even though the environment itself may change its conditions very quickly. And that's the end of chapter 18.